Hello, for the first time in Vralu 24, completely from the beginning to the end. English interview in English with a really special guest about what is going on around the world, in Ukraine, in United States, in Poland. About all these topics, we're going to talk with a very important person. But here with me in the studio is Michał Specjalski, editor-in-chief of the geopolitics and international law portal geopolity.org. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Peter.
And on the other side of the internet, our guest, very important person, the insider, I would say, is someone who's going to give us a light in this info wars, which is going on at the moment about these rockets in Poland, about the Ukrainian war, and about U.S. politics. Jim Jatras, retired former U.S. diplomat and retired GOP Senate foreign policy advisor. Hello, sir. Welcome to our show.
Hello. Hey, Peter, Mike, how are you? Glad to be here.
Thank you very much, guys, gentlemen, I would say. It's a pleasure to have you in the studio because you know what's going on, Michael. And yeah, the problem is, let's start maybe from the United States, because that'll be a great, like, an opening thing for our conversation.
Yeah,
we
have a lot of
yeah, we have a lot of questions for Mr. Jim. But where would you like to start about the elections in the United States?
Yeah, I think we're going to start with the question of elections, the outcome of the elections in the Senate and the House of the Representatives in the United States, and how if it's going to influence the U.S. foreign policy in this year and the next year.
You're going to ask the first question?
Yeah, this is the question.
So Jim,
Jim, do you track the outcome of these elections in U.S. Senate and U.S. The House of the Representatives? And do you feel that it's going to influence the Biden administration in the context of the armed conflict on Ukraine and in global politics? How do you see from the U.S. perspective? Do the Republicans are going to limit the financial help for Ukraine in the next year?
Well, to start with the elections themselves, just as there were many Americans, maybe a majority of Americans, who had very strong concerns that the 2020 election that removed Donald Trump was not a free and fair election, it was a corrupt election. I think there are many Americans now who are very suspicious of the outcome of these elections. We had a president with record low approval ratings, high inflation, which the poll showed was the number one concern of voters. Yet somehow the Republicans did very, very badly against the historical pattern. And some people, I would say many people, maybe most people, suggest that there was corruption in these elections, although, of course, it would be very hard to prove that. And even if you did prove it, it probably wouldn't make any difference. So you have that. So the Republicans did less well than expected. They will control the House of Representatives with a narrow majority. They will not get the Senate. And, of course, the White House was not up for grabs this year. In terms of what difference it will make, especially in the war in Ukraine, I don't think it will make much difference. In fact, even if the Republicans had done very well, it would not have made much difference, because even though you will have a few more what we might call Trump populists in the House and in the Senate, the vast majority of the Republican office holders in Congress are not of that stripe of Republican. They're not populists. They're not Trump people. And I think they're completely controlled by a neoconservative political agenda when it comes to foreign policy. And of course, there's a very strong influence of military industries with all the members, whether Republican or Democrat. I think all we'll see coming from the Republicans in the House is some question about, can we track the money better? Can we have better oversight? But that is just window dressing. They'll be just as eager to dump money on Ukraine as the Democrats are. And in fact, they may even call for more funding and try to accuse the Democrats of being weak on Ukraine so they can look very hairy-chested and tough. We're tough on Russia. We're tough on China. We're tough on Iran. So no, the general direction of American policy will not change. It could be even more militant now.
What was the main issue during the campaign? I mean, was Ukraine an issue, or was the money which the U.S. government sent to Ukraine, was one of those topics on the top?
No, it barely figured in there at all. And the prospect that we may stumble ourselves into a nuclear war registered hardly at all in any public concerns. There's no peace movement on the left. There's a small one on the right, but it doesn't count for much. The main concerns were economic, inflation, the cost of living. It helped, of course, that Biden drove the gasoline prices down by taking oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, because that had been a big concern of people early in the summer. I expect those prices to go back up now that the election is over. There was some effort to say that this was a referendum on abortion because the Supreme Court had overturned Roe v. Wade. Maybe there is some evidence of that, especially among female voters, but I don't think it was decisive. There's also accusations coming from both the Democrats and moderate Republicans that it was Trump's fault, and because Trump still has a great following among Republican voters, if not among Republican office holders, that he was a drag on the party and that the party needs to move past him, and that this is all his fault. But I think the main concerns were economic, and that's one reason why this outcome is a little bit surprising if we assume this was actually a fair election.
Okay, I'd like to follow up this question of Peter. You said that neoconservatives are still high in the Department of State. If the Republicans are winning or Democrats are winning, basically the neoconservatives or the liberal imperialists are running the Department of State. Could you explain this deep state structure, how it's in the U.S. foreign policy, that elections doesn't change the policy, the grand strategy of United States?
Yes, well, you mentioned two groups, the neoconservatives, who are primarily in the Republican Party, and then the liberal interventionists are mostly in the Democratic Party. These have two different pedigrees, if you will, ideologically. They come from the same origins, but they advocate the same kind of policies of global domination, benevolent global hegemony, as William Kristol and Robert Kagan, the two great ideologists of neoconservatives, pointed out in 1996. Kagan, by the way, is the husband of Victoria Nuland, who I would say is the chief architect of our policy toward Ukraine. But besides these groups, you have others, the so-called Vulcans, for example, that are really centered around the defense industry, excuse me, I should say the military industry. It's not really about defense. So I would say that there is a consensus of interest, both ideological and, frankly, money, that converge when it comes to having a policy of perpetual expansion, perpetual war, and perpetual meddling in other countries' affairs, including sanctions, military intervention, and so forth.
All right. What happened with those rockets in Poland? Because we have such a turbulence, a lot of lies, a lot of half-truths. In your opinion, what really happened there?
Well, I think it's pretty clear to everybody now, especially since even the U.S. and Poland have conceded that it was a Ukrainian rocket. To me, the big question is whether it was accidental that it fell in Poland by mistake, trying to shoot down Russian missiles, or whether it was a deliberate provocation by the Poles, a false flag, to try to get NATO directly involved in this war. I don't think we really know the answer to that. The idea that this is somehow still Russia's fault, well, it's raining here in Belgrade today, so I guess that's Russia's fault too. The idea that somehow anything that happens becomes part of the narrative about what this war is about, how it started, how it might finish. The fact that the United States was quick to say it was not a Russian missile, I think has caused some people to say, well, gosh, maybe now this means that the West is getting cold feet about this war, that the danger of an escalation of this war is over. I think that's premature to start popping the champagne corks. Clearly, the Western governments led by Washington and our various satellites in Europe are more than happy to keep this war going, keep pumping weapons in there and money to the regime in Kiev. The problem is, however, they're starting to run out of weapons. From numerous sources I've heard, at the rate the Ukrainians are using up weapons, there isn't much more to send them and the Western industrial capacity to produce more weapons quickly enough to make a difference on the battlefield simply is not there.
Yeah. So why do you think Zelensky and the Ukrainians are denying that this was a false, air defense missile that, by mistake was shot to the Polish territory? Do you have this? Do you see this connection between this situation and that Sullivan from the U.S. Department of State went to Russia and was negotiating with Russia, then went to Kiev, and then the Russian and the U.S. military agencies were negotiating in Turkey, I think the last week. Do you see this? Do you see this kind of a hypothesis that it could be a Ukraine provocation, to pulling the Poland and U.S. To this armed conflict? Do you see this?
Yes, I think the common denominator is, as I mentioned earlier, I think Ukraine's military situation would become desperate very soon. That, as I say, their weapons supplies are going to dry up. They're in severe manpower problems. As we know, and I'm sure this is a sensitive issue in your country, we don't know how many NATO personnel, particularly from Poland, are already participating directly in this war. And it seems to me in these circumstances, there's two possible ways out. One is to try to drag NATO in directly into the conflict in a war with Russia, and I think that would be the preferred option coming from Kiev. Maybe, I don't know how much Warsaw and certainly not Washington are prepared to do that. The other one would be to try to induce Moscow to agree to some sort of ceasefire or some kind of a Minsk III agreement that would stop the war, give the Russians, as we say, half a loaf, a partial victory, and then freeze the conflict. But I will tell you, talking to many friends here in Serbia and in Republika Srpska, in Bosnia, they're afraid that would simply be a repeat of the mistakes the Serbs made in the 1990s, when every time they had a military advantage, they would pull back from it in order to achieve some sort of an agreement with their so-called partners, agreement on terms that the other side had no intention of honoring. So I think the next question is, will there be some kind of a behind-the-scenes discussion on a ceasefire? I don't think the prospect of dragging NATO in right away will actually happen. But then the question is then will Moscow really launch some sort of winter offensive in the upcoming weeks? And those are questions that are, as far as I can tell, being decided by one man in the Kremlin, nobody in the West.
One more question, Peter. And how do you judge Zelensky's behavior? Because he's saying that this Ukraine stance on this rocket was made by reports from Ukrainian military, general, the main general of Ukraine. What's his name?
How you judge the thing that I will add it to your question, yes. Mike. How you judge that the Ukraine itself wants to participate, the whole thing. They trying to check it out, what's going on, what went there, what happened there. They said to our Polish government, we want to be part of the investigation. Yeah. We want to be part of it. We want to know. We want to deliver what we need to deliver. From my point of view, it's just they try to, I would say it, hide some kind of evidence that was them.
Influence the investigation.
Yeah. Influence the investigation in a bad way.
Yeah.
How you judge that? What would you say about that?
Well, maybe I'm naive, but my answer would be yes. Let's remember the Russians were excluded from the MH17 investigation, and so were the Donbas republics. The Russians are excluded from the Nord Stream sabotage investigation. I would say let's have a free and open investigation that everybody participates in. Let them bring their evidence to the table. Let the Ukrainians be part of the investigation. Let the Russians be part of the investigation, and do it as publicly as possible, and let people see that this is a transparent investigation instead of these black box investigations where nobody knows what the hell's going on.
And do you see this double policy in Ukraine, that we can see like a civil policy of Zelensky and the military policy? Do you see that Zelensky could be a kind of a political hostage of the Ukrainian army, that it's pushing for the not to negotiate? Because we saw in the beginning of this war that there was negotiation between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, and one of the Ukrainian yes, was killed going to the court. So I think there was a suspicion that it was a political killing by SBU. So do you feel that Zelensky maybe would like to negotiate with Putin, but the army is holding him, as a kind of a political hostage of its own policy that was made before?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Mike, because I want to add it, if I may. I heard like a rumor, a kind of theory about it, that Zelensky is a hostage, like you mentioned, of those who want to keep fighting, especially, let's say, Azov guys who want to be in the war, who want to fight till the end and want to win with Russia. You think that he would like to sit down and have some kind of agreement with Russia, or at least peace talks at this moment?
Well, I'm not a mind reader. You'll recall, and this is the common story for everybody, is that in March, the Ukrainians were ready to reach an agreement with the Russians, and it was actually Boris Johnson's visit that torpedoed that. So I think you have people not only in Kiev, but also in London and Washington and other capitals that are differ among themselves how they would like to proceed. For example, I would say the State Department in Washington is far more militant than some of the people at the Pentagon are, who are more, let's say, cognizant of the military realities. And when we talk about Kiev, yeah, I think there's a problem with the SBU, also with Pravy Sector and some of the really radical Banderist nationalists in Kiev, and actually in Western Ukraine, Lvov, even more so. And no, he is not a free agent. Even if he wanted to come to terms with the Russians, even if he wanted to negotiate, I don't think he's free to do so, not only from people within his own country, but from people in other capitals as well, London and Washington in particular. So that's one reason I think there will not be a negotiated solution, and also why I think from their point of view, the Russians would be well advised not to, they can be willing to talk. It's always good to talk. But if they actually were to place reliance on some kind of negotiated settlement, I think they would be making a big mistake.
Mike?
Yeah, I would like to add about the radical nationalists and the tensions between Poland and Ukraine that it's now hidden in the narrative. We had the last interview with Alexander Arestowicz that was saying that the Polish government in secret negotiation with Ukraine was saying that the Wolan massacre not going to be brought up, to the politics. That is a closed chapter of our relations. So how do you judge this? Because in Poland they're saying if you are saying now we have a war, so we can't say in Poland, we shouldn't say in Poland.
We should forget about it.
We should forget about it, about the Volhynian massacre. So the Ukrainians nationalists killed 200,000 Polish.
Yeah, I mean the estimation is different, but yes. It depends who says it. But they saying clearly, let's forget that they agree. Our government, Polish government, agreed to forget about the genocide in Volhynia, which is, to my mind, as a patriot, as a journalist, unimaginable. How you can judge that? Because in the name of good relationship with Ukraine, we need to forget about this. We need to forget that a lot of people who are fighting in Ukrainian army are fascists. We need to forget that
even Nazis.
Nazis. So how you can judge on that? And if you're gonna say it, of course you are a Putin spy.
Exactly. Well, a couple of days ago, for the first time here, I went to the Jasenovac concentration camp, which is now in Croatia, and where hundreds of thousands of Serbs were killed. Again, the numbers differ by the Ustasha movement. Sometimes it's very tempting to use words like fascist and Nazi and so forth without making ideological distinctions that. When we look at the Banderas in Ukraine or the Ustashi here in Croatia and Bosnia, there's a kind of a really elemental, organic, almost biological hatred that these people have for others. In the case of the banderas, not only for Russians and Poles and Jews. There's something pathological about this in a way that even transcends ideology. Even the world's nationalists and Nazi don't really seem to describe it properly. And of course, in communist Yugoslavia, they papered all over that in the name of, brotherhood, unity, bratstva i jedinstva, right? Well, I think unfortunately that same kind of Orwellian and doublethink is also here in this world. Well, we know what the Banderas did to the Poles in Volhynia in 1943, I guess it was, but let's pretend it didn't happen because we've got bigger fish to fry right now. I don't think I don't think it's right morally. I don't think it's right politically. And I think that's one reason, by the way, when we hear talk about maybe some forces would be inserted in Ukraine, like in Lvov or in Odessa, maybe the Russians would shrug their shoulders and say, "Hey, you want Lvov? You can have it. You can fight with the Banderas like spiders in a jar for the rest of history." These things can't be resolved by ignoring them, I don't think.
And do you think because this war is going to end sooner or later?
Yeah.
So it seems it's going to be later, and there are going to be more victims and so on. But after this, I don't know. Maybe Ukraine gonna take over the Crimea and Donbass and everything. But it's I think it's a positive, it's a positive and not realistic approach to the situation, the strategic situation on the soil. So my question is, if Ukraine gonna lose this war and gonna be cut out from the Novorossiya, this region that Russian Federation would like to cut out from Ukrainian territory. Do you think these radical nationalists are going to go back to their, homes on the western part of Ukraine? And do you think that they could be some, threat for the European countries or Poland in the future? Like when we're going to have like a radical nationalistic state, maybe Zelensky going to be, took out from the power and more nationalistic power going to take over the government?
Yeah, I think that's quite possible. Also, if Ukraine loses this war and Ukraine is partitioned, depending on what that partition looks like, how many of these people will come to Poland and other countries in Europe and will become a kind of an analog to the ISIS and Al Qaeda terrorist types that come in with all the migrants from the Middle East. Whether you'll start seeing unrest or terrorism coming from these people, maybe in revenge for having you're having allowed them to be defeated. I don't know. A lot of people expected the initial Russian attack in Ukraine to be like an American shock and awe type campaign, which it wasn't. And of course, the Russians now appear to be reconfiguring their strategy for what to do next. I'm still not sure if they launch a winter offensive, it will look like the kind of thing that the U.S. does when we go into another country. General Surovikin seems to be still talking about a long grind. Maybe that's partly deliberate to allow people in Ukraine who are, if you will, more European-oriented, which also includes not only these radical nationalists, but people who like Western liberalism, all the LGBT stuff and like that. Let them go to Europe. Let them go to Europe and let the people who remain behind be people that the Russians feel they can work with. I think maybe there's a sense of dividing up Ukraine, not only territorially, but even demographically, between people who think one way and people who think a different way.
What really happened over the years? The imagination in my head about a U.S. policy, about reality United States was always like, you are pretty conservative. So what happened? The Department of State becomes some kind of, promoter of LGBT, of wokeism, of
ecologism,
all this leftist craziness, which is absolutely out of this world. Neo-Marxism.
Yeah. We see U.S. embassies that have the rainbows, not with the U.S.
They're fighting and they afraid. For example, the ambassador of the U.S. in Warsaw always says, why you you don't want to accept the LGBT and stuff like that. What really went wrong?
He was giving in Warsaw Polish
the speech on the march.
No. The U.S. ambassador was giving a prize for transgenderism in Warsaw, I think, a month ago.
Yeah, something like that. So what really went wrong?
Well, as I like to say, there's no transatlanticism without transgenderism. That's my favorite slogan. They're going to put that on my tombstone. Both of these things, both this movement and neoconservatism go back to the communist movement in the 1920s. Neoconservatives led by Max Schachtman came out of the Communist Party, ended up as Social Democrats USA, took over the apparatus starting in the Reagan administration and especially in the second Bush administration. What they call the cultural Marxists, I'm not sure I really like that term, but it has some value to it. The so-called Frankfurt School, Marcuse, Adorno, Gramsci, people like this had a much more radical critique of society than the conventional Marxists, which were just based on class. Of course, they both agree on their anti-religious view. And this means the breakdown not only of nations, religions, races, all things that make a human being that define us in terms of our social relations have to be radically broken down so we can have a new society. It's just sort of another vision of a communist society. And this actually gained great currency, I would say, starting really in the 1960s with a revolution over the Vietnam War and also the African-American civil rights movement, then developing into feminism and finally into what we see today. But what we saw was they call these slow march through the institutions, taking over education, taking over the think tanks, and finally the corporations and the government. And now there's no looking back. This is the official ideology of the Western countries, not just the United States, but also, of course, as the European Union, which is one reason, as you know, Brussels, even apart from the questions of Ukraine, gives Poland such a hard time because you do have social policies that are not in step with the ones coming from Brussels.
So it leads to destruction. It leads to dystopia. It leads to a fall down of the society. That's my opinion. Yes. Maybe I'm just, for someone who is a fan of LGBT, says you're a fascist or whatever. They call me whatever. But do they see it? That this kind of particular way will lead to a fall down of the society?
Well, I don't know how familiar any of you are with the book, The Socialist Phenomenon by Igor Shafarevich, who is a good friend of Solzhenitsyn, in fact, who wrote the foreword to the book. He believes that these kind of Gnostic movements, like socialism in some contexts, is a manifestation of the human death instinct, that on some level human beings seek oblivion and even the destruction of society. And I do have to wonder how that dovetails with things like the Great Reset, Davos, and all of the rest of this. All of this, you will own nothing, you will live in a pod, you will eat bugs, you will be happy, you will simply become a cog in the machine. And this is also accompanied by, I would say, a radical depopulation agenda. What do we have? 8 billion people in the world today. The Georgia Guidestones, that were recently blown up in the state of Georgia, said the world population should be reduced to 500 million. Maybe at some point, as we achieve a true synthesis of human and machine, transhumanism, they just don't need so many people. So the idea that this is the death of society and the death of individual human beings is very closely related.
Okay, so well, to follow up this, so how do you see this globalistic agenda, this Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset, the Fourth Revolution, introducing the CBDC, so the central banking virtual currencies basket as a new kind of a structure, financial structure for the whole international trade maybe in the future, and that you said transhumanism. Are we in the times of the new neo-communistic global revolution?
I think we are, and what that means, I don't know. I recently wrote an epilogue to a book about the Antichrist from Uncut Mountain Press. It's an Orthodox press. Written by G.M. Davis, and he points to all the growth of Gnosticism over the centuries and how it is now becoming so powerful at our own day. Does this mean that the end of the world, the end of society, or maybe that doesn't happen for another 10,000 years? I don't really know, but I think we do see that there is a very strongly entrenched acceptance of this agenda for mankind. And I worry about it particularly in the corporate sphere. It's a bit of an irony that many American conservatives who are, quote, against socialism and are very suspicious when the government does something are not as suspicious at all as one big corporations, whether it's big finance, big media, information technology, the pharmaceutical company. I think the COVID and the lockdown, all of this was kind of a dry run for a much bigger agenda in the future. And of course, control of people's money, control of people's ability to buy and sell, to eat, to warm their homes, and so forth is a big part of that.
Yeah, so we can see that in the COVID times. You mentioned COVID times. In Europe, they introduced the lockdown policies that was like the same was in China. We can see now what's happening in China. A lot of provinces are lockdowns. There are protests. Even people are shot down. There are people. I saw videos that people are jumping up from their apartments even because they are like locked down without the food. They are shouting from their apartments in China now that they don't have a food. The Communistic Party members are locking down the shops and everything. So do you see this? Why European countries and why United States? Maybe it's less United States. I don't know. Is so keen to introduce this China model of globalization,
especially in Germany, which I can see the signs in Germany. This love for China is so high, so big that it really worries me. That they want to close the whole. They have a control over society completely.
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking. What do you think about that?
Biocontrol.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, when we talk about what they call social credit and all of these things, I think a lot of the Western, what sometimes called soft totalitarians, do admire the way the Chinese are able to do this. I'd say there's one big difference, though, is that the Communist Party of China, whatever its other faults, they see their job, if you will, is to make China great again. I believe in China as a nationality. They're Han nationalists, where in the Western countries, it seems that our elites deliberately want to break down any notion of nationality and religion and replace it with something that's completely divorced from those things. For example, in America, I would say these trends track very closely with what is called critical race theory, the idea that the founding ethnos of the United States, European, Christian, English-speaking, is irredeemably evil, and that just by simply being a white person, you're a bad person, and you need to be apologizing for the fact that you exist, and you can never apologize enough. It's very strange that you have the leadership of a country trying to destroy its own ethnic base, and in favor of what? In some kind of not only sexual diversity, but ethnic and racial diversity. To what end? To control or to actually extinguish the founding population? At least I don't think you have that in Poland yet. I don't think you have Polish authorities who are basically making war on Polishness the way that the American authorities are making war on the American identity, tearing down statues in a kind of a Soviet fashion and so forth.
All right, but you know what? I want to come back to sort of beginning of our conversation, of our interview. I want to ask directly about the Trump, because on the conservative side in Poland, we conservative journalists, a lot of still believes in him. I finished that. I'm not going to say that I'm a Trump supporter at the moment. Do you think he has any chances for upcoming presidential elections in the United States? And what do you really think about? Can he be a really conservative leader?
It's always dangerous to count Trump out. You remember so many times in 2016 and then into his administration, people would say Trump is finished, and then he would rise phoenix-like from the ashes of whatever it was they thought would finish him off. So I would never say that Trump cannot possibly get reelected or could not become that kind of leader. At the same time, I think the chances are not very good. Let's remember when he was president, when he had all the powers of the presidency, he was not in control of his administration. Now, part of that reason was he appointed appointed people like John Bolton and others who had no intention of carrying out any of the policies that he wanted to carry out. You also had the whole establishment, the deep state, the Democrats, the leadership of the Republican Party, the intelligence services, the media, and everybody else determined to sabotage him and make sure he couldn't do anything. That's one reason he was reduced to the pathetic status of calling it out on Twitter, for which he was later removed, calling on Twitter for his subordinate officials to do things he wanted them to do instead of just ordering them to do it. For example, all this business about the wall, why did he never say to the Pentagon, General, go secure the border? That's an order. He was able to do that, but would they have followed those orders? I don't know if they would have. So if he gets reelected, which I think is unlikely, I think that he would be in no more control of his administration than he was last time. Meanwhile, the drift of America from a cold civil war to maybe a hotter civil war and more violence would, I think, be greatly accentuated during his campaign if he was the Republican nominee, and even more so if he won.
Okay, how do you see the future of United States, like after the next U.S. presidential elections? Do we gonna have like a radicalization of each side, and do you see that even United States can, there could be like separatist states, there could be like try to break out from the federation, even so if the European dollar gonna collapse in the international trade, maybe like in the really bad scenario? Do you see this black scenario for United States?
I think if the Western side prevails in Ukraine, it may get a new lease on life. First taking Russia down and then confronting China. And then if they are able to achieve global domination, to digest that for how many years, maybe decades, the same way the Soviet Union was able to live on borrowed capital for a very long time until the contradictions in its system caught up with it. On the other hand, if the war in Ukraine goes well for the Russians, I think that will accelerate the breakup of NATO and its evil twin, the European Union, and we will have a multipolar order. If that is the case, and I think that's the more likely scenario, that means in the fairly near future, the United States going through something domestically the way the Soviet Union and Russia went something through the same process in the 1990s. The difference is that whereas the Soviet structure allowed some possibility for a national divorce or a breakup of the country, it's much more difficult in the United States. There's no constitutional mechanism for doing this, and if you look at many states that are not deep red or deep blue, as we say, but have a kind of an uneasy coexistence between blue cities and red countryside, it's not easy to see how there could be a national divorce in the United States. If there is something like a hot civil war, I don't think it will look like 1861 to 1865. It will look more like Lebanon or Bosnia or something like this.
Okay, so many analysts say that, of course, that this Ukraine-Russia war is a proxy war between the United States and Russia Federation. But in the bigger perspective, in the bigger picture, it's a part of a bigger rivalry between United States and People's Republic of China. So, like weakening the Russia Federation, not to be supportive for China in the future. So, how do you see China behavior in this armed conflict, and what is your opinion about is it only the beginning of the greater war, a greater conflict between the United States and the Chinese People's Republic?
I think, again, it depends partly on how things turn out in Ukraine. I'm not a China expert, but it seems to me absurd that President Biden's administration went to the Chinese to say, can you help us put pressure on the Russians? Why in the world would the Chinese want to do that? What? Help us take the Russians down so we can focus on taking you down later? Why would the Chinese agree with that? I hear talk from Americans that, the Chinese are very upset about this. I think the Chinese are thrilled. They see somebody else taking on the Americans, and this has now become an existential struggle, not just for the Russians nationally, but for the U.S. empire internationally. If the Russians win the war in Ukraine, I think the U.S. empire will crumble. Does that mean then a war with China? I think quite to the contrary. It means there will not be a war that the U.S. will have no choice but to relinquish its leading position in the world, or at least its attempt to dominate the world totally, although I think it will remain the principal power for some time. On the other hand, if the Russians lose and then the Chinese are then confronted by the U.S.-dominated world without the support of China, that's going to put them in a very difficult position. I think they'll have no choice but to fight.
Okay, what about Iran? What about the Middle East? Because that's a really important part of the world. I remember Obama words, we cannot have two wars in the same time as the U.S. Do you think that is the huge possibility that the United States will quit on Ukraine if something happens on the Middle East?
I don't think we would quit on Ukraine, but if they feel the war in Ukraine is going badly, I think they will look at other points of pressure where they can let's say asymmetrically put pressure on the Russians by attacking their proxies or allies. I would certainly put Iran near the top of that list, but also Syria, the Republic of Srpska in Bosnia, and also in Kosovo. There's a lot of places where we can turn the heat up in a way that the Russians would find unpleasant and not really be able to respond, especially since they're quite busy in Ukraine.
Yeah, so my question, I think one of my last questions would be, what is the scenario for Poland from your perspective? Because our elites, political elites, have this mentality that without United States involvement in the Central Europe, we're gonna be,
safe.
We're gonna be in a problem between Russia Federation and Germany or European Union led by Germany. So if United States is gonna lose this proxy war, what would be the scenario for Poland and the policy for Poland that you would advise Polish government, to sustain the Polish state and some position in the situation when Ukraine wouldn't win the war with Russia Federation and the United States with Russia Federation?
Well, my policy recommendation, as a patriot, my policy recommendation of any country is put your own country first. Poland's policy should be Poland first, Russia's first, America first, and so on. Serbia first. If I were Polish, and again, I don't want to be, let's say, rude to anybody in Poland, I think I would take a harder look at the map. As you said, you've got Russia on the side, Germany on that side. I'm not sure how much sense it makes in terms of your national welfare to be on bad terms with either of them, much less both of them, and say that some country from across the sea is going to be your champion and can be a substitute for a good relationship with your neighbors. Look, some people have said that the whole purpose of expanding NATO, the whole purpose of this war, the whole purpose of destroying Nord Stream was to make sure that there could be no friendship between Berlin and Moscow. Now, some people in Poland might say, well, we don't want Berlin and Moscow to be friends because that would be at our expense. I can see that, but then ask me a question. Look at Western Europe. Are the Benelux countries better off with Germany and France being friends, or are they worse off? It seems nowadays they're better off. So is it possible to achieve some sort of general good feeling and neighborliness among the countries of Central and Eastern Europe based on friendship between Berlin and Moscow? Or is it necessary to try to blow the whole thing up and hope somebody from across the sea is going to pull a rabbit out of their hat?
Jim Jatras, retired former U.S. diplomat and former GOP Senate foreign policy advisor. Jim, thank you very much for your time and for your wise words.
Thank you, Peter and Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
In studio, Michał Specjalski, editor-in-chief of the geopolitics and international law portal geopolity.org. Was doing this conversation with Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
For your participation and for your knowledge as well.
It was a pleasure.
A pleasure as well. And me, Piotr Szlachtowicz, thank you very much. That was the first, I hope, first of few or many interviews like that. Mike, what do you say?
Yeah, I'm open for the discussion with you, Peter, and other international guests.
I think it went well. Thank you very much, guys, for your attention. Forward wherever you can, like it. Pass it forward. Let these words, the true words about what is happening going forward. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.